Chernobyl nuclear disaster. Most people have heard of Chernobyl. Some of you might have even watched the HBO series about it. But if you don't know much beyond the name, today you're going to learn all about it. In the early hours of April the 26th, 1986, Reactor 4 at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant in northern Ukraine, which was part of the Soviet Union at the time, exploded. It wasn't a nuclear blast, but a chemical reaction that caused the reactor to melt down. This was the worst nuclear accident in history. Much worse than the partial meltdown at 3 Mile Island in 1979 or the Fukushima disaster in 2011, caused by a massive earthquake and tsunami. Chernobyl stands out as the most devastating nuclear accident ever. Today, we're going to look at what happened, how nuclear power plants work, how this explosion occurred, the Soviet response, and the condition of Chernobyl today. Nuclear energy is powerful, but when mistakes happen, the consequences can be deadly. So, let's dive into the history of the Chernobyl disaster and break down the science behind it in the simplest way possible. Understanding how these reactors work will help explain what went wrong that night. So, what is a nuclear reactor for? It generates electricity without burning fossil fuels. Here's how it works. Like a steam engine, a nuclear reactor heats water to make steam. That steam spins a turbine, which generates electricity. Steam engines do the same thing, but burn coal to heat the water. The idea behind nuclear energy is to do this in a cleaner way, using atoms instead of coal. Most nuclear power plants use uranium. One special type, uranium-235, is really good for this process. It goes through fission, which means splitting an atom in half. But to keep things simple, I'll just call it uranium from now on. When uranium splits, it produces heat. A lot of heat. This heat boils water, creating steam, which turns the turbine, generating electricity. So how do we split uranium atoms? We fire neutrons at them. Neutrons are tiny, super dense particles found in almost all elements. When a neutron hits uranium, it breaks apart, causing fission. And here's the key part. When uranium splits, it releases more neutrons, which then split even more uranium atoms. This keeps the process going as long as we keep supplying uranium fuel. Once the process starts, neutrons keep bouncing around, making more heat. This heat is what we need to make electricity. But there's something important to think about: speed. For a neutron to hit a uranium atom and split it, it can't be too fast. If neutrons are moving too quickly in all directions, they won't hit their target. So, to make fission work, we have to control the speed of the neutrons. This process is called moderation. Simply put, we need to slow them down so they can do their job. The best way to do this? Water. When neutrons hit water molecules, their speed slows down. This happens because of hydrogen in H2O. Hydrogen has about the same mass as a neutron, so when they collide, the neutron slows down. There's another option too, graphite, which is a form of carbon. It can work as a moderator, but it needs to be very pure. If there are elements like boron mixed in, they will absorb the neutrons instead of slowing them down, which would stop the reaction. Most nuclear reactors today use water because it does two jobs. It slows neutrons down to keep the reaction going. It cools the reactor so it doesn't get too hot. This water also turns into steam, which spins turbines to make electricity. But here's the cool part. Water is also a safety system. If the water disappears, the neutrons start moving too fast and the reaction slows down. This is called a negative void coefficient, a fancy way of saying the reactor loses power if there's no water to slow the neutrons. But what if we use graphite to slow down the neutrons and water to cool the reactor? That's when things can get tricky. When the water is gone, it's a big problem. The water isn't what slows down the neutrons. Even without water, neutrons still cause fission. The graphite is what slows them down and keeps the reaction going. This means the reactor keeps making heat, even if there's no water to cool it. Without cooling, the core can overheat, leading to dangerous things like meltdowns, explosions, and pressure buildup. This situation is called a positive void coefficient. It's key to understanding what went wrong at Chernobyl. Too much fission creates too much heat, which makes more steam. With graphite still slowing neutrons, the reactor power rises instead of dropping. So, even without enough water, the reactor keeps getting hotter. To control this, we use control rods. These rods absorb neutrons to stop them from causing more fission. Boron is great for this. When neutrons are absorbed, they can't fly around causing more reactions. This is how we manage the reactor's power. Let's talk about how nuclear reactors make electricity without using fossil fuels. Fossil fuels like coal and oil will run out one day, so we need other options. Nuclear reactors use a process called fission to create heat. This heat makes steam, which spins turbines to generate electricity. Fission happens when neutrons hit uranium atoms, causing them to split. To control this process, we use moderators to slow down the neutrons. If the reaction gets too fast, control rods absorb some neutrons to keep things safe and steady. This is the basic idea behind nuclear energy. Understanding this helps us learn about events like the Chernobyl disaster. Back in the 1930s, scientists first discovered fission. An Italian physicist, Enrico Fermi, shot neutrons at uranium atoms and saw they split, producing heat. Other scientists in Europe found the same results. This discovery excited many people because it showed a new way to produce energy through a chain reaction that keeps going on its own. You can break uranium to make heat and more neutrons. This process can keep going as long as you have enough uranium. The first working nuclear reactor started in December 1942 in Chicago. This was the start of the nuclear age. Sadly, most of the focus on nuclear power was for weapons, not energy. Why? Because it was 1942, during World War II. The US was at war after Pearl Harbor, so war efforts were a priority. You might have heard of the Manhattan Project, where the US created the atomic bomb. This project led to the bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki on August 6 and 9, 1945. After World War II, the main rival for the US wasn't Germany or Japan, it was the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was different. In 1917, Russia had a communist revolution. The Bolsheviks, led by Vladimir Lenin, took power. Their goal was to share resources equally among the people. Lenin, and later Joseph Stalin, led a country where the Communist Party claimed to know what was best for the people. The people were expected to follow the party without question. This system was full of secrets and lies, but became a model for other anti-capitalist or anti-Western nations. After World War II, tensions rose between the US and the Soviet Union, starting the Cold War. When the US used nuclear bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the Soviets saw America as a serious threat. In response, they developed their own nuclear weapons and energy. While American nuclear plants used water to control reactions, Soviet plants used graphite. Chernobyl's plant used a type of reactor called the RBMK-1000. At the time of the accident, 4 reactors were running. Each had a uranium core surrounded by graphite blocks inside a large cylindrical tank. Imagine a big paint can or water tower. Vertical uranium rods sat inside, with graphite slowing the neutrons to help the uranium split, a process called fission. Water flowed through pipes to absorb heat, turning into steam to generate power, while keeping the system from overheating. At the top of this tank, 21 control rods were lowered into the core. Control rods help manage the reactor's power. They contain materials like boron, which absorb neutrons when they multiply too fast and create too much power. There are always some rods inside the core to keep things stable. You never remove them all because you need to control the reaction. The entire setup was surrounded by a thick concrete shield to block radiation from fission. Watching this process directly isn't possible because it produces strong ionizing radiation. This radiation moves at the speed of light and can damage your DNA. Too much exposure weakens your cells, which can lead to death. It can also cause cancer as cells start growing abnormally. What's interesting about this design, the RBMK-1000, is that it used graphite as a moderator instead of water. While most reactors worldwide used water, the Soviet Union chose graphite. This choice caused a positive void coefficient. If the water turned into steam from overheating, the reactor would get even more powerful. In Western reactors, water slows neutrons, making too much fission less likely without it. But at Chernobyl, losing water didn't slow things down, it made them worse. They needed to shut down the reactor fast. For that, they had the AZ-5 button, also known as a scram. It's an emergency shutdown for the nuclear reactor, like a kill switch. When pressed, all control rods should go into the core at once, absorb the neutrons, stop the chain reaction, and end the fission process. Simple, right? Now that we understand that, what went wrong at Chernobyl? If you think it has something to do with the graphite moderator and the reactor getting hotter, even without water, you're correct. But before we talk about the reactor's fatal flaw, let's focus on the night it happened. The head of the Chernobyl plant was Viktor Brukhanov, a Soviet engineer. He helped build and run the plant. He wanted to use water reactors, but the Soviet government chose the RBMK model, used only in the Soviet Union. Like many Soviet projects, things were rushed, materials were cheap, and corners were cut. Brukhanov was very stressed about how badly the construction was going. In 1972, he even tried to quit, but the Communist Party didn't let him and told him to finish the job. The plant was finally completed in 1977, and the fourth reactor started working in 1984. Brukhanov and other high-ranking engineers were not able to pull off before officially turning on the reactor, was to run several safety tests. Brukhanov, who managed the plant, gave the task to Chief Engineer Nikolai Fomin. Fomin approved it and handed it over to Deputy Chief Engineer Anatoly Dyatlov. The test was about checking the power system. If the power went out, backup generators would start to keep the reactor running. But the problem was that these generators took 60 to 90 seconds to fully turn on. The goal was to make sure the water pumps kept the reactor cool during that time. They wanted to see if the turbines could keep producing enough electricity as they shut down, just until the backup generators started working. The test was simple. Check if the leftover energy could keep the water pumps running during that gap. The people in charge, Brukhanov, Fomin, and their team, had already tried this test 3 times before. It failed every time. Moscow was pressuring Brukhanov to make it work, and Fomin promised it would, because their jobs depended on it. The test was set for the afternoon of April the 25th, but it got delayed. Factory workers in Kiev couldn't afford a power drop during their shifts since they had strict quotas to meet. To avoid disrupting them, Fomin asked his deputy engineer Anatoly to do the test at night. That was the first big mistake. The night shift workers didn't know about the test until they arrived. Worse, they weren't trained for it. Some were experienced, but many were new to nuclear science. For the test to work, the reactor needed to run at 700 megawatts. To put that in perspective, the reactor usually ran at 3,200 megawatts. Before the test, they lowered it to half power, 1,600 megawatts, but things didn't go as planned. The test was supposed to start on the afternoon of April 25th, but when it got delayed, the engineers decided to keep the reactor running at half power. At first, this might not seem like a big deal, just less energy for a while, right? But it actually caused serious problems. Here's why. During fission, neutrons split uranium atoms. This process creates heat, which is later turned into electricity. It also releases more neutrons. But there's something else. It creates a chemical called xenon-135. Xenon-135 is an isotope, which means it's the same element but with more neutrons. Normal xenon has a mass of 131, but xenon-135 is heavier and unstable. It's known as a nuclear poison because it absorbs neutrons better than almost anything else. When the reactor runs normally, xenon-135 burns away. But when power drops too low or the control rods stay in too long, xenon-135 doesn't burn off. Instead, it absorbs neutrons, making the power drop even more. If this happens, the reactor can almost shut down completely, something you definitely don't want when running a power plant. Now, back to the test. Reactor 4 was running at half power for about 10 hours. During this time, a gas called xenon-135 built up in the core. This is known as xenon poisoning. After midnight, Chief Engineer Anatoly Dyatlov came into the control room and told his team to start the test. They had an instruction manual, but none of them were fully trained. The test was handled by Shift Supervisor Alexander Akimov and Senior Reactor Control Engineer Leonid Toptanov. To show how inexperienced they were, Toptanov was just 25 years old and responsible for a nuclear reactor. Dyatlov told them to lower the power to 700 megawatts. Akimov and Toptanov carefully followed their instructions, but suddenly the power dropped too much. They didn't realize that xenon poisoning was causing this by absorbing the neutrons needed for power. The reactor's power fell to just 30 megawatts. At this point, they should have stopped the test. When the core is poisoned, you must slowly increase power over time to get rid of the extra xenon. It's similar to scuba diving. If you dive deep, you can't rush back to the surface. You need to come up slowly to stay safe. You're going to get decompression sickness, also known as the bends. It's caused by nitrogen in your blood. To avoid it, you have to come up slowly from deep water. There's a specific process. Stay at one depth for a while, then move up step by step. You even need training for it because it's dangerous. Now, Professor David Rusich, an energy expert from Illinois, explains a similar rule for nuclear reactors. If the power gets too low, you have to wait 3 days before increasing it again. This is because of something called xenon poisoning. But Diov, Fomin, and Bryukhanov were under pressure to finish their test. Diov ignored all safety rules and ordered his team to raise the power however they could. So, what's the fastest way to increase power in a reactor? You need neutrons to move around at the right speed to keep the reaction going. The team decided to remove most of the control rods, which normally absorb neutrons to lower power. They had just spent an hour inserting these rods to reduce power for the test. But now, they pulled out almost all of them, leaving only 6 out of 211. This did increase power, but only to 200 megawatts instead of the 700 needed for the test. Still, Diov insisted they continue. While preparing for the test, the operators turned on 2 backup cooling pumps, making all 8 working. This increased water flow, reducing empty spaces in the reactor core. Normally, this would trigger an automatic shutdown, but the operators disabled it. Since the coolant was absorbing neutrons, only 6 control rods were left for safety. According to the safety rules, at least 28 rods should have been in the core. With fewer rods to control the power, the reactor started a dangerous cycle. The cooling water became the main neutron absorber, and the risk of disaster grew. The command was given to stop the valves of turbine number 8. As the turbine slowed down, the power to the water pump decreased. This caused the coolant to heat up, creating more empty spaces. With less water absorbing neutrons, the reactor's power started rising. A dangerous cycle was beginning in the lower part of the core. Seeing the power increase, the operators pressed the AZ5 button to insert the control rods. What they didn't know was that the Soviet RBMK reactors had a dangerous flaw. To cut costs, the control rods had graphite tips, the same material that helps the reaction happen. So when 205 control rods were pushed into the reactor at the same time, the first thing they touched was 205 pieces of graphite. Instead of slowing things down, the graphite tips made the reaction even stronger. Worse, they pushed out any remaining water in the channels, making the reactor even hotter. Then, a steam explosion happened. The power shot up so fast that the reactor couldn't handle it. The steam had nowhere to go. The result? A massive explosion. But it wasn't a nuclear blast. It was a steam explosion. The force was so strong that the reactor's 2-ton metal lid shot into the air. When it crashed back down, it destroyed pipes, walls, and everything around it. Burning pieces of graphite flew everywhere, landing on the roof and nearby buildings. The hot graphite, now exposed to air, caught fire. Then came a second explosion. Scientists still debate what exactly caused it, but one thing is clear: the reactor core was now wide open. Radioactive particles were pouring into the air, spreading even faster because of the burning graphite. Even after this, Diov was in shock. He refused to believe the core was destroyed. He ordered workers to open the cooling system, thinking water could fix it, but the reactor wasn't there anymore. By doing this, many workers were exposed to deadly levels of radiation, sealing their fate within minutes. The HBO miniseries makes it seem like people started feeling sick from radiation right away, but that's not true. However, many workers in the control room and reactor hall died soon after from severe radiation sickness. One worker, Valery Kodemchuk, was in the pump room when the explosion happened. He died instantly. His body is still trapped in there today, or at least whatever remains of it. When they manually turned on the cooling system, instead of helping, it flooded the hallways and basement with radioactive water. The reactor had just exploded, and the heat was intense. Pouring water on the fire only created radioactive steam. Meanwhile, hydrogen and oxygen mixed and caused more explosions. The local fire department was called to put out the fire at Chernobyl, but they weren't told the truth about what happened. Even the plant's own administrators didn't believe the reactor could explode. No one did. The nearby town of Pripyat was built for the plant workers and their families. It was a closed city, meaning only those connected to the plant could live there. Despite being isolated, it had everything: schools, shops, and even its own fire department. The Chernobyl Fire Brigade rushed in, not realizing how deadly the radiation was. Tragically, they all received fatal doses, including one of the fire truck drivers. The firefighters were ordered to put out the flames on the roof to stop the fire from reaching Reactor 3. By 5 a.m., they managed to extinguish it, But inside the destroyed reactor, the fire kept burning. The core was now an open pit of nuclear fuel. A team was put together to handle the disaster, stop the fire, clean up the site, and most importantly, keep it all secret. The government's biggest fear was the world discovering that Soviet science had failed. They didn't want their enemies, especially America, to know. To hide the truth, they locked down the city and told people to continue their daily lives. It took 2 days before they finally ordered an evacuation. Among those leading the response were Boris Sherbina, a high-ranking official, and Valery Legasov, a scientist. If you've seen the miniseries, they were the main characters played by Stellan Skarsgård and Jared Harris. The fire was releasing deadly radiation every second, so they had to find a way to put it out. Water wouldn't work. The fire was so hot that it caused the oxygen and hydrogen in the water to explode, making things worse. Legasov suggested using a mix of sand, boron, and other neutron-absorbing materials. The sand would smother the flames, and the boron would help stop the reaction. Helicopters spent days dropping the mix from above, but they couldn't fly directly over the reactor due to the extreme radiation. They had to drop it from the side, using the wind to guide it in. What they didn't realize was that much of the sand missed the target. Eventually, they managed to put out the fire, but the crisis wasn't over. They had to clear radioactive debris from the roof and surrounding areas, dig tunnels under the reactor to stop the fuel from reaching the groundwater, and send divers into the basement to drain the coolant water before it caused another explosion. It was a massive operation that cost the Soviet Union millions. But what's even more shocking is how they tried to hide it. The Soviet government let people work in the radioactive zone just to keep the disaster a secret from the outside world. Chernobyl wasn't the Soviet Union's first nuclear disaster. In 1975, a concrete tank at the Leningrad nuclear power plant near St. Petersburg exploded. Less than a month later, a cooling system failure led to contaminated water leaking into the environment. Later that year, a fuel channel wasn't getting coolant, causing a partial meltdown that released radiation for about a month. No one in the area was warned. People were exposed to radiation, and the incident was never reported in Soviet media. The reactor at Leningrad was the first RBMK reactor, the same type used in Chernobyl. An investigation recommended safety improvements, but the Soviet Union ignored them and covered up the whole event. Years later, when scientists investigated Chernobyl, including Valery Legasov, they uncovered the truth. The government knew the RBMK reactors had serious risks, but chose to do nothing. They didn't even warn their own people about the dangerous flaw in the A5 kill switch. Why would a government allow such danger when its job is to protect its people? The answer? Power and control. During the Cold War, the Soviet Union was in constant competition with the West, especially the United States. They wanted to prove their system, one where the government controlled everything, was stronger. The Soviet government wanted to control every part of its citizens' lives, just like Western capitalist countries. If the Americans could develop nuclear technology, the Soviets believed they could do it even better. Science and technology were a big part of Soviet identity, so admitting failure was like admitting weakness. When the Chernobyl reactor exploded, the government refused to admit that poor technology was the cause. They kept everything secret and closely watched those involved in the cleanup. But then, a power plant in Sweden noticed something strange. Radiation levels outside their facility were too high. They found radioactive materials that could only come from a nuclear reactor, proving that a major accident had happened. It didn't take long to trace it back to Chernobyl. At first, the Soviet government tried to downplay the situation. Instead of admitting to an explosion, they released a vague statement. There has been an accident at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. One of the reactors was damaged. The situation is being handled, and help has been provided to those affected. An investigation is underway. That statement barely said anything. On top of that, they started making excuses, even claiming that the 3 Mile Island accident in the US was much worse, when in reality, it wasn't. This was typical Soviet strategy. Misdirection is a common tactic. Instead of answering tough questions, the Soviet government often shifted focus. If someone brought up concerns, they responded with counter-questions. For example, when people criticized the Chernobyl disaster, they pointed to the 3 Mile Island accident in the US rather than addressing the issue directly. Maintaining the Soviet Union's reputation was their top priority. Their propaganda machine worked hard to downplay the severity of Chernobyl and make the West look just as bad, if not worse. In August 1986, Valery Legasov represented the Soviet Union at the International Atomic Energy Agency. He knew the RBMK reactors had design flaws, but instead of admitting that, he blamed the explosion on operator mistakes. While the plant workers did break safety rules, the real issue was the flawed control rods with graphite tips, something the government had known about but chose to keep secret. Legasov may have been pressured by the Soviet leadership, or perhaps he wanted to protect his own standing in the party. Either way, he didn't reveal the full truth. If he had exposed the government's cover-up, he would have faced severe consequences. Instead, he convinced the world that the disaster was caused by human error and wasn't as bad as people feared. A year later, in July 1987, several key figures in the Chernobyl disaster faced trial. The men involved in the incident were put on trial in criminal court. Alexander Akimov and Leonid Toptanov, the two operators who pressed the AZ-5 button and triggered the explosion, had already died from severe radiation poisoning. Others who survived, including Viktor Bryukhanov and Anatoly Dyatlov, were found guilty for their roles in the disaster. Dyatlov, who played a major role in the mistakes that night, was sentenced to 10 years in prison for criminal negligence, but he only served 3. During the trial, the truth about the RBMK reactor's fatal design flaws was revealed. Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev wanted the public to know, but higher authorities stopped him. The information never left the courtroom, showing the power of the Soviet government's control over information. Around the same time as the trial, Gorbachev wrote that Chernobyl made me and my colleagues rethink a great many things. The accident, its global discussion, and disastrous fallout across huge Soviet areas shattered the Soviet militarized mentality to the core. The lessons of Chernobyl called for the reversal of secrecy and xenophobia for fundamental rethinking of security in the nuclear age. To understand why Gorbachev took this stance, it helps to know the historical background. At that time, he was pushing for a policy called glasnost, which aimed to make the government more open. People were losing trust in the communist system, and Chernobyl only made that worse. Secrecy around the Chernobyl disaster only made people trust the government even less. Gorbachev wanted to make changes, but the Soviet system was still secretive. Even he wasn't told much about the accident for several days, showing how slow and corrupt the government had become. Years later, in 2006, Gorbachev said that the nuclear meltdown at Chernobyl 20 years ago was perhaps the real cause of the collapse of the Soviet Union. The Chernobyl disaster, more than anything else, opens the possibility of much greater freedom of expression, to the point that the system as we knew it could no longer continue. It made absolutely clear how important it was to continue the policy of glasnost. And I must say that I started to think about the time in terms of pre-Chernobyl and post-Chernobyl. The cleanup and containment of the disaster cost the Soviet Union over 188 billion rubles, which is around $2.9 billion today. This huge cost pushed the Soviet economy closer to collapse, making the country's downfall even more certain. So, what is Chernobyl like today? Less than a year after the explosion, engineers built a structure to cover the reactor and its dangerous debris. Radioactive materials were buried inside, and efforts to clean the site continued. A protective structure was built to stop radioactive fuel from sinking into the ground. It was called a sarcophagus. However, like many Soviet projects, it wasn't built well and started cracking soon after. To prevent more radiation from escaping or another disaster from happening, a new cover was built over it. This new structure, called the New Safe Confinement, was completed in 2016. It cost about 2.2 billion euros and is designed to last 100 years. If you're still around in 2116, let us know if it's holding up. On February 14, 2025, a drone struck the protective shelter over Chernobyl's Reactor 4. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky stated that a Russian drone carrying a high-explosive warhead caused significant damage to the shelter, leading to a fire that was promptly extinguished. Despite the damage, radiation levels remain normal, as confirmed by the International Atomic Energy Agency. Russia denied involvement, suggesting the incident was staged by Ukraine to disrupt peace negotiations. The attack has raised concerns about the safety of nuclear sites amid ongoing conflicts. Today, the area around the Chernobyl power plant is still unsafe. Tourists can visit, but only for a short time before the radiation becomes risky. Nature has taken over, with wild animals roaming the abandoned land. Experts believe it will take at least 100 years before the area is safe to live in again. Thanks for joining me for this episode of The Memory Machine, and I hope you've enjoyed the story of the Chernobyl nuclear disaster.